Interrompemos esse podcast para perguntar: quem você quer ser?
Designer,
engenheira, pedagoga,
administrador.
Quer saber? O Senac EAD é nota máxima no MEC. Tem cursos de diversas áreas, com conteúdo elaborado por especialistas do mercado e professores mestres e doutores. Ainda tem o Senac Carreiras, conectando estudantes a vagas de emprego em todo o país. Saiba mais em ead.senac.br/graduação.
Whether it's infancy, or 2 and 3-year-olds, or 17-year-olds, the goal is exactly the same. Pay attention to the fact that the kid is distressed. And by the way, even though that sounds like a no-brainer, it's not a given. Don't be so caught up in what the frustration response is. I fully acknowledge some frustration responses are less adaptive, more disruptive, more dangerous than others. Pay attention to what the kid is communicating and collaborate with the kid on solving those problems together.
I'm Debbie Reber, and welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. As I mentioned in the conversation you're about to listen to, I refer to Dr. Ross Greene's Collaborative and Proactive Solutions Model, or CPS, in just about every talk I gave to a parent community. His quote, "Kids do well when they can," changed my life when I first read it about 15 years ago, and it remains as powerful to me today. So I was so excited to welcome Ross back to the show to talk about his problem-solving model and how it can be effectively used with very young children, even infants. So before I get into that, if you're new to CPS, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to our first conversation for the show, which you can find at tiltparenting.com/session81. In that episode, we explored this problem-solving approach in great detail. But in the meantime, in this conversation, we delved into why it's crucial to shift from a compliance-focused approach to one of collaboration and understanding, even starting as early as age 2. We also talked about how what we often label as a difficult baby is actually an infant struggling to meet our expectations, how using CPS can significantly enhance kids' well-being, and why we want to question the underlying reasons behind adult concerns. All of these are concepts explored in the powerful new documentary, It's Never Too Early, CPS with Very Young Kids. If this is your first time encountering his work, Dr. Ross Greene is a clinical psychologist and the originator of the innovative evidence-based approach called Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, as described in his influential books, The Explosive Child, Lost at School, Lost and Found, and Raising Human Beings. He also developed and executive produced the award-winning documentary, The Kids We Lose, which came out in 2018. Ross was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for over 20 years and is now founding director of the nonprofit Lives in the Balance. Over the years, Ross has worked with thousands of kids with concerning behaviors and their caregivers, and he and his colleagues have overseen the implementation and evaluation of the CPS model in countless schools, inpatient psychiatric units, and residential and juvenile detention facilities with dramatic effect. Significant reductions in recidivism, discipline referrals, detention, suspensions, and the use of restraint and seclusion. This is such a good conversation, and I love that Dr. Greene presents a true reframe for how to perceive and respond to any challenging behaviors. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, Ross, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me to come back.
I've honestly been looking for an excuse to bring you back to the show. And then I heard about your new documentary about using CPS with young children. And I was like, this is the perfect opportunity. So I'd love to talk about that. But before we do, I was just saying before I hit record, you were last on the show almost 7 years ago. I think we were talking about The Kids We Lose documentary and also, of course, touching base on all your books. But I'd love if you could talk a little bit about maybe just an update from our last interview, like where your focus is. And I'd also love to hear about what the response was to your work surrounding The Kids We Lose.
Well, I have been sort of interrupted by COVID, but not really devoting myself to the nonprofit that I founded, Lives in the Balance. We've really been expanding, number one, all the free resources on the CPS model on the website, but number two, our advocacy and legislative efforts. I now think of us as among the leading organizations advocating against punitive exclusionary disciplinary practices federally, at the state level, internationally. I was just participating in a briefing in Washington, D.C. on the Keeping All Students Safe Act, which would make it harder for schools to restrain and seclude kids. There's corporal punishment legislation. There's legislation aimed at protecting kids in residential facilities. A lot going on at the state level. So that's been a big part of what we've been doing at Lives in the Balance. We also now have close to 5,000 grassroots advocators who are helping us out. That's been a major focal point at Lives in the Balance. We're still training all over the world, schools, treatment facilities, parents, on the collaborative and proactive solutions model. And in terms of what I'm working on right now, it's a book that is what I'm most pumped up about these days, which is just how long, for decades really, we've been teaching educators and staff in treatment facilities about how to de-escalate and restrain kids. That just simply means that we've been de-escalating and restraining kids a lot, when we could have been teaching them instead how to proactively solve the problems that are causing kids to become escalated in the first place. And as I said in our recent newsletter, the harm that we could have been preventing is immeasurable. So that's in the pipeline, as well as like the 8 other books that I wish I had the time to write.
I relate to that. And just even hearing you share all of that, like I'm going back to when I first discovered the explosive child, when my child, who's about to be 20, was 6, I think, and just kind of following your work over the years. And listeners, I'm just going to say now, if you didn't hear our first conversation, I'll have it in the show notes. Listen to that. I will have so many links in the show notes. The B Team is an amazing resource on Facebook. We actually had someone from your community join my community for a private conversation to really walk us through the resources. There's so much, and I'm so excited and awed by the work that you're doing with policy. That to me seems like the most powerful work in so many ways, and probably the most cumbersome in terms of really trying to get change to happen. What's that been like?
That has been interesting. Getting anything done at the federal level these days is interesting and glacial. I think we're having more success at the state level. We passed a restraint and seclusion bill here in Maine about 2 years ago. Different states are considering similar bills. So I think that things are moving more quickly, though not always immediately successfully at the state level, but it's a process. There's a Canadian bill to get people to stop hitting kids. The good news is Lives in the Balance is sort of a hub, not only of free resources on the CPS model and all kinds of support for people, but also the hub of all of those advocacy and policy efforts on that sort of legislation. So it's been a little bit of a learning curve. Things don't move as quickly as you would like. But I guess my attitude is this. There's 2 ways to go here. Both are fine. One is to mandate change, which legislation does. And the other is just to help people get trained in a different way of thinking and doing things. I'm fine with door number 2 without legislation. Sometimes it just takes legislation to give it the push that it needs. Nothing moves as quickly as I would like it to, though.
Before we pivot to your documentary and what we'll be spending the most of this conversation talking about, I just wanted to ask on a global level, because as I mentioned before we hit record, we're moving back to the Netherlands. I get asked a lot about just the state of neurodivergent understanding and awareness in school systems in the EU and the UK and around the world. Can you just talk for a moment about the awareness of and willingness to explore a different, more peaceful approach to supporting kids?
Variable is the key word here. CPS has always met with favor in Scandinavia. I'm just back from Australia and New Zealand, where they are also looking for how to do things differently. We are exploding in Ireland right now because of a very huge project we have going on there. So it's variable. There are states and places, countries that are not as interested. I tend to think of Scandinavia, despite some current drifting in the wrong direction, as among the most enlightened on how kids are treated. 60 some odd countries have passed bills so that people can't hit kids anymore. So obviously that's going well. The neurodivergent community, in my opinion, has been probably the most outspoken community when it comes to the harms done by punitive exclusionary disciplinary practices, because they probably have been the people on the receiving end of those harms more than any others. And that is gaining a foothold as well in different places. So if you squint your eyes, we're moving in the right direction. If you focus on certain states that still like restraining, secluding, and hitting kids, you might not come to that opinion, but all in due course.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for addressing that. So someone from your team reached out because you were doing a grassroots effort to really spread the word about a documentary called It's Never Too Early, CPS with Very Young Kids. Can you tell us first what this is about and what encouraged you to get this out into the world?
People being skeptical about whether 3, 4, and 5-year-olds can be engaged in the process of collaboratively solving the problems that are affecting their lives. We've always known that the answer is yes, but thanks to some funding from Coleman Family Ventures, we were able to actually pursue a project in which we filmed 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds being engaged in that process and filmed lots of parents for the documentary Never Too Early, talking about their goals for their very young kids, their aspirations, their fears about the world. Their kids are inheriting the skills their kids are going to need to be in that world. And quite frankly, how the process of solving problems collaboratively and proactively with kids might help them learn those skills. But me, I got this in my blood. For me, even 3-year-olds are 3 years delayed on us solving problems collaboratively with kids. I think you start with infants, with the basics. And the basics are being attuned to what kids are struggling with, applying a solution, and getting feedback from the kid about whether what you thought was going wrong and what you thought would fix it, how well you're doing. And I would just call that not only good parenting, but being responsive to the hand you've been dealt. I don't view the CPS model as being any different. As I've always said, I don't think anybody has a problem, generally speaking, with doing what I just described with infants. I think that at around the age of 2, and I said this in the film, 2 very interesting forces come together. Number one, us caregivers, for whatever reason, start to become obsessed with compliance the minute the kid turns 2. And they, the kids who have always known what they wanted, basically from the minute they pop out, some interesting skills kick in for them to permit them to go for it. Locomotion and language. So now 2 interesting forces are coming together. A kid who can now go for it, and caregivers who decided that compliance is their number one priority, which, as I said in the film, is probably why we call it the terrible 2s. Why would we not continue being responsive to the hand we've been dealt and meeting kids where they're at from age 0 to forever? That's, of course, the big question.
Yeah, and that's the question I want to get your answer from. We're going to take a quick break, but I want to go a little deeper there. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Greene Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Greene Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words, straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Greene Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos, so the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. I'm so glad you spelled that out. I actually pulled out that quote because it jumped out at me. Around the age of 2 is when most parents decide compliance is their priority. And I felt very seen when you said that. Why do you think that is? That is the big question. But what happens at that time?
Because the kid is now going for it, I think caregivers feel a loss of a sense of control. I would argue you aren't in control from the word go, and thinking you are is delusional. This kid was somebody the minute they popped out. This is not a blank slate. So the goal of parenting, once again, is to be responsive to the hand you've been dealt. The best you can shoot for, and I talked about this in Raising Human Beings, is influence. You are the kid's partner. The more you shoot for control, the less control you end up having. So I think it's a bit of a feeling that you've lost control. You know, when they're an infant, they can't do anything. They just lay there, right? And you hold them and you try to get them to smile at you. You are thrilled when they look happy. Little by little, they start going for it. But I also think we live, perhaps more so in the United States than some other places, but also perhaps so more in some other places than the United States. We live in a society here that tends to be pretty compliance-oriented. And of course, we apply that to our kids. I also think there's convenience involved. I think that it feels more convenient and easier to just have a kid who, when you say jump, says how high. But I also think we feel judged if we have a kid who doesn't. I think those are some of the reasons.
Absolutely. And, you said, going back to the infancy in the documentary, that crying it out is a form of insisting on compliance. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly right. You said your top priority in that moment is either compliance or convenience. So it does start very young. And as you said, our kids are not blank slates. You said infants are very good at letting you know if you've got it right or wrong. Could you say more about just that infancy relationship? You mentioned being attuned and responsive, and I think of Mona Delahook's work, and I know you two are close colleagues as well, and it's so exciting to see much more information out there about how to do this. But could you talk about specifically CPS with an infant? Are there any other things we would want to know about that?
The key is to pay attention to what an infant is telling you, both when they're happy and when they are distressed. When they're happy, you're probably fine. When they're distressed, they're telling you something. And by the way, I need to make the point that we'll go back to infants. That's true with 3-year-olds and 8-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 67-year-olds. When they're distressed, they're telling you something. And what they're telling you is that there's some expectation they're having difficulty meeting. Regrettably, especially as kids get older, we pay more attention to the way they're communicating that than we do to what they're communicating. And of course, The kids I've been working with for a very long time are the ones who communicate that they're frustrated in ways that tend to be maladaptive, but they're still communicating something important, and that is that they're frustrated. For a very long time, we've been primarily paying attention to the frustration response, not to what the frustration response is telling us. Okay, that's true for every kid, and quite frankly, largely true for adults as well. Now back to infants. Infants have some characteristic ways of letting us know they're distressed. I don't have to go into detail there because everybody who's had an infant knows, and most people who didn't have an infant know too. What are they distressed about? Kind of the same stuff. Hunger, heat, cold, lights, noises. I got 13-year-olds who I work with who are still distressed by those things, right? Novelty, changes. These are things that distress human beings. Right? There are infants, sometimes we say that they have a difficult temperament, who are distressed more often and by more things and in ways that are more extreme. And there are infants, we call them easy, who are distressed by fewer things. And when they are distressed, they are not as distressed. Okay, that's good to know, but they're all still communicating something, right? Even easy infants get distressed sometimes. It's just that their stress response isn't as toxic to us adults, right? There are infants. I used to be good colleagues with a researcher who did research on infant cries. And there are infant cries that are just excruciating, that may actually cause some infants to be more at risk of maltreatment because of the characteristics of their cry. So that just tells us what we already knew, but it tells us that it starts from zero. There are kids who communicate that they're having difficulty meeting expectations, that they're distressed, that they're stressed in ways that are less adaptive than others. It doesn't change throughout the lifespan. So for me, whether it's infancy or 2 and 3-year-olds or 17-year-olds, the goal is exactly the same. Pay attention to the fact that the kid is distressed. And by the way, even though that sounds like a no-brainer, it's not a given. Don't be so caught up in what the frustration response is. I fully acknowledge some frustration responses are less adaptive, more disruptive, more dangerous than others. Pay attention to what the kid is communicating and collaborate with the kid on solving those problems together. A lot of what we've been doing since B.F. Skinner is we've been paying attention to the behavior and we've been trying to modify it. And the bad news is rewarding and or punishing behavior does not solve a single problem that's causing that behavior. We're covering a lot of territory here.
We really are. My brain is going in 10 different directions. I want to pivot to talking about values a little bit because that was a big piece of the film. But I just want to say that I had many aha moments, and I live, eat, and breathe this stuff and have for a long time. And so I always get quite chuffed when I'm still like, whoa, even you saying a difficult infant, which I was like, yep, that's what I had, right? A difficult infant is just an infant who has difficulty meeting our expectations.
Let's take my daughter as an example. She's 26 now, but as an infant, if we had the expectation that she would sleep through the night, we were screwed. And I was the nighttime guy. Walking her tended not to work. The only thing I could find that worked was driving her around in the car at 2 o'clock in the morning. I like to tell her, I don't think I have felt rested since she was an infant. There you go, parental guilt. But it might be true. Right? But eventually we were able to get her to sleep at night. But what it mostly took was trying to pay attention to what she was telling us about what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. The other option, and there are people who would do this, and I don't fault them for doing this. I just don't think this fits the definition of being responsive, who would let the kid cry it out. For some people, that's a matter of philosophy. For others, it's a matter of desperation. I was unable to do that, and I don't suspect that it would have worked. And even the guy, Dr. Reber, who recommended that many years ago, I was sitting next to him on an airplane, and he was expressing regrets about having given that advice. So I've got firsthand experience with an infant who's having difficulty meeting an expectation. We really have the expectation that you sleep through the night. Now, what are we going to do if you're having difficulty meeting that expectation? As kids get a little bit older, meaning they can tell you, many of them. That makes it, in my opinion, a little bit easier. Otherwise, as you would with non-speaking kids of any age, you are dependent on your powers of observation and trial and error. Hopefully, eventually, you get to know the kid and you sense patterns in what could be the matter and patterns in the solutions that might work. But this is a very different approach than solving all problems by sticking a bottle in the kid's mouth.
Thank you for sharing that. There were a lot of drives at 2 a.m. in Seattle up to Northgate Mall in that Honda, I remember, a long time ago. So totally relate to that. Let's take a quick break, and then I want to talk a little bit about 2 and 3-year-olds. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything, because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
If you're a parent, I invite you to join us at the Mindful Mama podcast, where it's all about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. With sometimes hilarious and always thought-provoking experts and friends, at Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm Hunter Clark-Fields, and I can't wait to see you there. Listen in to the Mindful Mama podcast.
Let's move to the preschool age. What I found so interesting about this part of the documentary was you did talk to a lot of parents and you asked them questions like, what do you want for your kids? And it was really about values. And there was something about that that really struck me, because I could have told you my values then, but I didn't parent to achieve those values. Can you talk about that? I mean, again, it seems like such a simple reframe, but it kind of blew my mind.
It's a big deal, because I think that us parents often don't give ourselves the luxury of thinking about our values. We're busy, we're paying attention to what other people think. I would call this values-based parenting. You should be basing your parenting based on what your values are and what you want for your kid and who you want that kid to be. And that's going to translate directly into whether you are primarily using parenting strategies that are oriented toward power and control, or parenting strategies that are more oriented toward collaboration and problem solving. And, there's other ways to slice the pie, but for me, that's a big part of the dichotomy. But that should be based on values. What kind of parent do I want to be? Who do I want to help my kid be? What am I trying to transmit to my child? And I actually thought that was one of the best parts of the film, where we're hearing parents of lots of different ethnicities and socioeconomic strata and from all kinds of different countries talking about values and what kind of parenting practices coincide with those values. What a great discussion to have with people. And it's something people really like talking about, but as you said, just don't really give themselves the luxury to think about very much.
It was really powerful. And I watched that and I thought, With parents of such young children too, right? Like there's such a hope and an optimism and, this very clear vision. And I'll just say, I was like, yeah. And then your child has their own agenda. And so you're always constantly having to meld your desires and wishes with this other human. And for me, I was wondering, how do we keep those values to the forefront so we're always prioritizing them? Like, what kind of habits can we create? Because as our kids get older, there is judgment. There are expectations in different environments. And I feel like it gets harder and harder just to stay honed in.
I think that we should give ourselves the luxury to write down what our values are really early in the process. Hang on to that. I actually think those values especially serve you well when other kids are involved, when other parents are involved, when schools are involved, because of my values. And I've had the luxury of thinking about values more than most because I've written about it and thought it through. Not that I think it's that complicated. None of the parents in the film, none of them practiced for the interview. It's amazing how easily it came out of them, right? Who do you want your kid to be? What kind of parent do you want to be? It's a luxury to think about it, but it's also a luxury to continue reflecting on it. I knew how I wanted my kids to be treated. And so when my son's hockey coach, when he was 6, when my son came off the ice one time and we were walking to the car and he said to me, "Daddy, what does pathetic mean?" I said, "Where did you hear that word?" He said, "Coach so-and-so told me that my play in the corner was pathetic." Okay, my values then kicked in. The coach immediately got an email. He denied it. I don't imagine that my son had ever heard the word pathetic before, so I knew it probably went down. But that's me saying, don't treat my kid that way. And you shouldn't be treating other kids that way either. I don't care if you're a hockey coach. I don't care what the hockey vibe is. I care about how you treat my kid and who I want my kid to be when they grow up and what I want them to have modeled for them as it relates to how to solve a problem, even if that problem is unsatisfactory performance. By the way, unsatisfactory performance at age 6 could be on the hockey rink. At age 12, it could be academic. At age 27, it could be in a job. I will also want my kids to know, if you aren't being treated this way, you have a choice. You have agency. You can choose to stay in it. You can say to yourself, this is not how I choose to be treated. I'm out. Good. I want my kids to know they have agency. I want them to know how they should be treated in their job, in their relationships. That starts from 0 and never stops. I think the important thing is we need to think about it ahead of time and keep reflecting on it.
Yeah, and notice those intuitive hits. Like you had that wasn't even intuitive. That was a very visceral response when you heard your son say that word. But we need to pay attention to when we get those signals and get curious about what is that about and why does that feel wrong? And then we can take the appropriate action.
But here's what's interesting. My reaction, which was based on values, was probably different than some other potential reactions, which may have been based on different values. I could have said, well, that's hockey. I could have said, well, you need to listen to coach when he tells you you're not doing a good job. I didn't tell my son that the feedback was invalid. I had no idea what the play was in the corner anyways, right? I grew up in Florida. What do I know about hockey? So the feedback wasn't invalid. The way it was communicated left a lot to be desired. That's it.
Super interesting. What we're not going to do in this conversation, because we're going to be wrapping up, is walk through the collaborative and proactive solutions model. Listeners, if you're not familiar with it, go back and listen to our first interview and look at the show notes pages. There will be so many resources to walk through that. It's a game changer. I probably mention it in every talk that I give to parent communities because it's so powerful. I do want to ask you, well, there was a quote that jumped out at me when you're talking about defining the adult concerns, which is really such a key part of this process is why does this matter? You said, if you don't know why this is important, that the expectation is met, I don't know why you have this expectation. It was another mic drop moment. Any kind of advice for parents to catch themselves or start to really question why they care so much about the things they care about that could get in the way of having this collaboration with our kids?
think that's part of the reflecting on one's values. Values lead us to what we expect from our kids. If we value, as I said in the film, and by the way, the best place for people to get a tutorial is in the film. If they watch the film, they'll know about the CPS model for sure. If we value a clean room, then that will have implications for our expectations for our kids, right? It's not something I valued particularly, so I didn't care. My son's bed was never made. My daughter's bed was always made perfectly, right? I don't care. It's not a value I hold, right? My values are related to how you treat people. I have expectations around that. How you expect to be treated. I have expectations around that. But I think that all starts with, what do you value? What's important? And coming up with that on your own. It's not really up to other people to define your values for you. It's up to you. It's your kid. It's your values. It's your expectations. You get to pick them. And if somebody else is picking your expectations for you and they don't jive with your values, that's a conversation.
Thank you. So, okay, the documentary, it's called Never Too Early, CPS with Very Young Kids. I have it here on YouTube. How can listeners view it? And how can we, as a community, I've got a big listenership, how can we support it in spreading the word?
Watch it and tell people about it. They can watch it not only on YouTube, but straight from the Lives in the Balance website. So first of all, they got to get on the website, livesinthebalance.org. Then they go to Our Solution in the upper nav bar, scroll down to CPS with Young Kids, and they can watch the film and the accompanying examples of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds doing the problem-solving process straight from the Lives in the Balance website.
And I just want to say, I've had this conversation with Mona so many times too. Like, if I had had access to brain body parenting as the parent of a young child, I would have done things so much differently. And I'm so grateful for any parent who has access to this model and can start using it with their young kids. I feel like it's going to prevent so much harm. And it's really part of this bigger shift that we're all working towards, having our kids grow up knowing that they're respected, understanding who they are, and being good humans, right? Before we say goodbye, any words of wisdom or anything you want to share that we didn't get to in this conversation?
As you were talking, I was thinking one of the things I like best about the model is that it not only takes into account the kids' concerns, and we've been spending a lot of time in the last decade, perhaps, teaching kids to make sure they're taking care of themselves, say what they need, but it also takes into account the adults' concerns. And, at various points in history, we've been teaching adults that their concerns are paramount. Neither has to be paramount. They can coexist, and we can come up with solutions together. And this is my statement on current world events. We can come up with solutions together even to longstanding problems that take into account the concerns of both parties. And at the very least, we can teach our kids how to do that.
Dr. Greene, thank you so much. I so appreciated this conversation and getting to catch up with you, and we'll continue to follow and support your work. And just thanks for everything you shared today.
Much appreciated. Thanks for inviting me to do this.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. To learn more about today's guest and the resources we talked about, check out the extensive show notes page on Tilt Parenting. There you'll find key takeaways, links to all the resources mentioned, and even a full transcript of our conversation. Just go to tiltparenting.com/podcast and select this episode. If you're looking for personal support from me and connection with the phenomenal community of parents raising neurodivergent kids, join us in the recently rebooted Differently Wired Club. The new Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Go to tiltparenting.com/club to learn more. The Tilt Parenting Podcast is hosted by me, Debbie Reber, author of Differently Wired and the founder of Tilt Parenting, and was edited by Andrea Curtis Amasquita. To support this show, please join my Patreon campaign where you can set up a small monthly contribution. Just go to patreon.com/tiltparenting to learn more. If you want to follow Tilt on social media, you can find us at @tiltparenting on Instagram and Facebook. And lastly, please take a minute to leave a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. That helps this show stay visible so others can find it more easily. And that's all for this week. Stay safe, stay well, and take good care. And for more information about any of the parenting resources Tilt offers, visit tiltparenting.com.
Are you overwhelmed by the things that get in the way of you doing what you want to do? Are you looking for ways to simplify life to better align with your values? Do you want to create space in your schedule so you have room for more of the good stuff? Play, joy, relationships, gratitude, and more? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I invite you to check out Edit Your Life, a podcast to help you edit the unnecessary from your life so you have more room to enjoy the awesome. Through episodes with me, Christine Coe, and a range of super smart, compassionate, and thoughtful guests, you'll come away with big picture insights and practical ways to declutter your home, schedule, and mental space without getting bogged down by perfection. I have always believed that small moments and actions matter tremendously. My goal is to help you find agency and space in your life through doable baby steps that will leave you feeling accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Check out Edit Your Life wherever you enjoy your podcasts.